Alexandra De Filippo, and I am a principal advisor at the Behavioral Insights team in New York. We're really excited to be talking today about a topic that is actually a bit frontier. So this session is not the typical BX session in the sense that we're not presenting results, we're not sharing the latest on something, and we're actually not talking so much about solutions and findings, we're talking more about processes and how hard it is to actually apply behavioral insights to some kind of like more complex issues. Because the answer, unfortunately, to these really tricky questions that we practitioners think about a lot is that it's complicated. Traditionally, we thought, if we give people information about something, they will make the best choice for themselves. So if we tell people, for example, in the global south or in some country in developing context, that chlorine is, if you treat your water with chlorine, you'll have better health outcomes at home and you will have a better life, we would have expected them to use chlorine in their water. Similarly, we would have expected that if farmers know that fertilizer leads to better yields and better livelihoods, they would do their best to actually use fertilizer. But we know that despite high awareness of the benefits of both chlorine and fertilizers, for example, there's actually very low take-up. And in that sense, behavioral insights, or behavioral science in general, came to revolutionize the way that we think about these issues. Because now we know that small changes in the context in which people make decisions actually can have a disproportionate effect. So the research of Michael Kramer and Esther Duflo and others in Kenya shows, for example, in the case of chlorine, making it available at the point of use, having that easy accessibility to a chlorine dispenser, actually changes uptake and can actually significantly increase its use. In the case of fertilizer, thinking more about the timing when you actually encourage people to buy fertilizer can have an impact. Reaching out when they have money and cognitive bandwidth to make a better decision is better than other methods of reaching out to them when they typically need it, that is right at the beginning of the session, when they have less money and cognitive bandwidth. So in the words of Iris Bonet, changing process is often much easier than actually changing minds, right? And this is important because actually this can sometimes lead to cognitive dissonance. If I start behaving in a different way, all of a sudden I feel uncomfortable that my prior beliefs are not aligned with the way I'm behaving. So what I do oftentimes is just change my attitudes and my beliefs to justify why I behaved in a certain way. So if I ask you, why did you use chlorine or fertilizer, I may say, oh, it was easily available, and also it's the best thing for my family. So it actually turns out that beliefs and attitude change can follow behavior change. Now, of course, this is not always possible. Sometimes we don't have control over the process or the space where people make decisions. Sometimes some of these behaviors are hidden. So, for example, it's the case with violence or corruption. We don't know when or where these behaviors happen. Sometimes it's also not appropriate because they relate to issues of identity or how we construct our own self-image, or because there may be power dynamics at play. So it is in those moments that we as practitioners need to think about how do we apply behavioral science. And this is actually a tricky question. We've seen that many interventions that had been successful are now failing to replicate, or we can't apply them again. And it may be because actually they're not as effective, or it may also be because we're tackling the wrong barrier. We're not thinking about the barrier that is actually at play in that specific moment. So let's talk about a topic that you have all just been thinking about, and that maybe recently we have become more conscious of, which is the idea that we're all probably trying to eat less meat. So I may engage with that topic at a cognitive level, and I say my beliefs are, I really care about the environment, I really care about sustainability, so I'm going to stop eating so much meat. And there I generate my intention to change. But as we know from the work of Susan Fiske and others, our minds and our beliefs and our emotions, our hearts, can disagree. So maybe, even though I want to eat less meat, grandma cooks my favorite meat pie, and I feel really guilty, and I cave in, and all my conviction goes out the door, right? Or maybe that is different if I go out with my friends who are meat eaters or my friends who are vegetarians. Maybe there's also that issue that now restaurants have delicious meals easily available, so that's not that big a trade-off. Because it's more available, it's easier. So all these factors play a role in the way that we end up behaving and end up either following through with an intention to change our behavior or not. So when you're starting to work on a new issue, it's actually quite complicated to decide, should I be engaging with people at a cognitive level with their beliefs and emotions, or should I instead be working through their social networks because they're influenced by their peers, or should I be changing the context in which they make that decision? And when you're starting a new project, it's often not very clear. So to answer that question, we have today a fantastic lineup of panelists who are going to help us, who are going to share insights into how they do it in their own work. So we're going to have 4 panelists. The first one is Sonia Whitehead. She's the head of research for the BBC Media Action, which is the charitable arm of BBC Media. In all her years at the BBC, she has been overseeing research in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East into what role media plays for development and in spreading best practices on the effectiveness of that media inside the BBC and outside. We will then hear from Benjamin Kumpf, who is currently the head of innovation at the UK Department for International Development. He was previously at UNDP as the head of the innovation facility, and in all his work, he has been thinking very critically about the intersection of digital technologies, innovation, and sustainability from the beginning, from exploration to experimentation to scale up. And Ben has done a lot of work as well at the grassroots, thinking about complex issues like gender-based violence and social cohesion, so that work is quite informed by practical experience. We then hear from Pippa Yeats, who brings a different and interesting perspective, as she has a background in design. So she's been thinking about how to combine human-centered design and behavioral insights in using large-scale platforms like WhatsApp, using exactly the platform that we just used. So Pippa was previously at Preckle.org as the head of design and strategy. And as in that role, she was thinking of ICT for development solutions for NGOs, governments, and other social impact organizations. She's now the product manager for the newest product at Preckle.org, which is Torn.io, and is this WhatsApp platform that we have just used, which has the purpose of reaching people at scale through WhatsApp to encourage and track behaviors offline through digital technologies. And lastly, but not least, of course, we will hear from Katherine Rodrigues, who is the Deputy Director of Quality and Strategy in the Department for Research and Innovation at the International Rescue Committee. And her work focuses on understanding how behavioral insights could be applied in humanitarian contexts, particularly in the cases of child safety and cash transfers in crisis-affected contexts. In her previous job, she was also doing mixed methods evaluations in Liberia and Ethiopia, thinking about the impact of cash transfers. So with that, I leave it to our first panelist, Sonia Whitehead, who's going to start talking to us about how do we actually get this diagnosis right.
Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about some research that we conducted a couple of years ago as part of a multi-country project that we did, funded by the Department for International Development. And in this project, it was multi-country across 3 themes: governance, health, and resilience. We did a lot of work, not only in evaluating our media interventions, but also in understanding how change happens. And that's what I'm going to concentrate on today. So we looked at 3 different interventions across the 3 themes. One was a health drama in Bangladesh, which was addressing preparing for birth and other maternal child health issues. And the second one was a reality TV show in Bangladesh to support people to adapt changes to extreme weather. And then the third one was a debate show in Tanzania where general audience asked questions of government officials to increase civic participation. And in each case, we tested a hypothetical model built together through existing evidence, qualitative research, and contextual information on how we thought change happens. And this theory of change was also used to design the intervention itself. And then we used quantitative data taken from national representative surveys using a statistical technique called structural equation modelling to really understand how change happens. So now I'm going to show you 3 models, and sorry if you won't be able to read all of it, but I'll take you through the key points. So, first of all, the health drama in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, the qualitative research showed that social norms were deeply entrenched, that mothers were not making the decisions to visit a health facility or other antenatal care services themselves. They were heavily influenced by their husbands and also their mother-in-laws, and quite often they didn't have the confidence to ask those questions and deliberate in those discussions. So we decided to put together a drama which really addressed these deeply entrenched social norms, and then had an accompanying factual programme which discussed those issues in more depth. So the model that we put together was this one here, which shows that we were looking at barriers to medical care, social norms, beliefs, attitudes. The model shows the orange is actually the significant pathways, and the red is not significant. So here we see that knowledge and barriers to care did not have such an influence. But we did see some direct pathways, so that people that were exposed to the drama did take behaviour related to antenatal care, such as visiting a health facility. But where most change was happening was mediated through both discussion and social norms. So it showed that the modelling that we were doing in terms of discussion and also really addressing those social norms was the right way to go, and where we needed to concentrate on going forward in future programming. So the next one was the reality TV show in Bangladesh. Here, people were given, basically the TV program went around different communities in Bangladesh and showed people how they could use local resources to take action in their own way. So, for example, it could be growing a different crop, it could be raising the plinth of their houses, or other such things. And we saw 2 clear pathways for this work. And actually, for this work, we saw a lot of behaviour change. About 47% of people could name an action they'd taken as a result of watching the programme. And I think you could see this in the pathways too, in the fact that, as you can see on the right, it was a much more direct pathway. What was happening was that people that were exposed to the programmes, if they had perceived risk, and if they could perceive the risk of changes in climate, then they were taking action. And then the other pathway that we saw was that people who felt that the government weren't going to support them were actually more likely to take action, because they felt that then they had more belief that they needed to do it themselves and work with the community to do it. So we took these results and continued to really strengthen the modelling around communities working together and people working together rather than being reliant on the government. And then also really increasing the awareness of the risks. So whilst initially in the programme we didn't talk about the risks of extreme weather in such detail, later on we addressed those in more detail. And then finally, we do quite a lot of debate shows across different countries, working with media to do discussion shows, a bit like Question Time, where people from the audience question officials and politicians. And we've seen quite consistent results across our countries in the fact that the sort of 3 key factors that are in that pathway to change is knowledge, discussion, and confidence and self-efficacy. And what we've seen is that whilst there might be some direct pathways that people that watch or listen take action, and when we talk about civic participation, we have quite a range from people solving problems in the community or questioning a government official, we've seen that knowledge and discussion are the key mediators. So what tends to happen is that when people feel they have more knowledge, they then feel that they can participate in more discussion, which then gives them more confidence to participate in political discussion more broadly. And we've seen this come out of our qualitative work as well. And so what we've seen here is that what's really key in our discussion shows is to really model that discussion and to also show how people in the real life can use that discussion and not just have it as a panel show, but actually take people out of the studio and show and model people in their community discussing these issues. So in conclusion, what we've really seen, and this mirrors what Alex was talking about earlier, was that we really need to understand the audience and the context to really understand how behaviour happens and to really look at how our communication can address the specific aspects of that pathway, whether that be addressing social norms, whether that be looking at facilitating discussion. And that is twofold. We need that to design the intervention itself, but then also to understand that impact, and then also to understand that to adapt and refine the interventions going forward. But I think, broadly across this work, what we've really learned as an organisation is just the role that social norms and discussion plays as a mediator. Sorry, that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but there's quite a few publications online that go into this in more detail. Thank you.
Good afternoon. In addressing the question whether to change behaviors to shift attitudes or address attitudes to shift behavior, I'm going to share some considerations of design principles when addressing a global problem, violence against women and girls. Globally, 1 out of 3 women experience physical violence during her lifetime, according to the World Health Organization. The status quo is unacceptable. When addressing gender-based violence, it becomes pretty clear that we're not dealing with a straightforward causal behavior. If we think about a radically different future, if we draw the image of a future without violence against women and girls, it's clear that that image entails very deep changes in our societies. So we're dealing with a complex problem. We're dealing with a problem that is rooted in deep gender inequalities in our social and economic structures. The design principles I'm going to share are rooted on findings from a global program of the Department for International Development called What Works. What Works was launched in 2014 with those 3 tracks and investigates with strict evidence 15 innovative approaches addressing violence against women and girls across 13 countries. And thinking about what comes first, behavior change to shift attitudes or vice versa, here's a conclusion from what we've learned over the last 5 years across 13 countries. When designing behavior change interventions to address gender-based violence, we have to think of a gender transformative approach and bake that into our behavioral design from the get-go. What does that mean? It means when we first investigate the problem and define it, we have to take into consideration the systemic factors contributing to gender inequalities and gender-based violence. So of course we look at the individual and the group level, but we also have to look closely at the structural level. And we know, for example, that geopolitical dynamics can have a huge impact on individual identity creation, which in turn might facilitate the prevalence of gender-based violence. I'm going to talk about a specific program in the context of What Works called SASA. SASA is a community-based program in Uganda that addresses intimate partner violence specifically and HIV/AIDS. SASA was implemented in 4 communities in Uganda, and a randomized control trial was designed to investigate its impact with 4 control group communities. At baseline, a cross-sectional survey was taken of 2,000 community members in total to measure attitudes and prevalence of intimate partner violence, and then 4 years post-baseline, so 1 year after the end of the intervention, again. SASA has interesting principles at its foundation, which I'll come to in a minute. First, some results. We see clear positive outcomes in terms of concrete prevalence of intimate partner violence and attitudes. Most importantly, we see a decrease of actual physical violence against women in their intimate relationships. And this was sustained. In the design of SASA, there was a very important consideration made in terms of looking at the attitudes of individuals, differentiated to their moral beliefs, and what they think is factually right or wrong, as well as social norms. The importance to not just think broadly of attitudes is clear when we think, for example, about a great motivation for a large number of young men that joined ISIS. In 2014, I worked in Jordan on the Syria crisis response, so that included a lot of work with Syrian refugees and host communities and refugee camps. And this is anecdotal, but a lot of conversations with family members revealed that young men increasingly went back after they fled Syria to their home country to join an armed group, and ISIS was the number one choice. And when I asked why, the young men themselves and the family members unisono responded, because we see that now women have to work. A lot of the times, the dad wasn't either able or around to be the breadwinner of the family. And while their attitude was, yeah, we have to make things work, quite flexible, they felt that that strong moral and religious belief was not in line with what's happening here, and a great motivator to go back to join the most chauvinist group that was active on the ground, ISIS. So in addressing, for example, these young men specifically, we have to differentiate. Are we addressing their attitude, which was flexible, actually in favor of women engaging in livelihood activities, or are we addressing other elements? This morning, Cass spoke about a case study from Saudi Arabia, which I actually also prepared, so I won't go along into it. When we talk about social norms, addressing gender-based violence has the component of supporting activists, norm entrepreneurs, which is crucial. But it can also go by making a prevalent but hidden social norm salient, as in Saudi Arabia. The experiment that Cass laid out this morning, in a nutshell, was interviewing Saudi men about their attitudes, whether their spouses should be allowed to work, and their assumptions, what is the prevalent social norm, what do other men think? And then making just the attitude of the majority of other men salient in the treatment group had significant impact on women actually going to work because of changes in the household dynamic. Going back to SASA, this is the approach of SASA that looks at systemic factors, which I won't go into details. The reason why I put up their approach is, one, I'm a big fan of their work, but secondly, they have a consideration in their design which I invite you to take on board, coming from a behavioral science perspective, which is outlined down here and highlighted here. SASA, as many other of the considerations that address gender-based violence on community level, starts with a reflection on power dynamics. And baking the analysis of structural gender inequalities and power dynamics into a behavioral design is what I suggest potentially the next step to improve our work to address gender-based violence. In a nutshell, the power within is a well-known concept for behavioral scientists. And we know the evidence on the positive impacts of working on self-affirmation and working on growth mindset with, for example, students to increase educational outcomes. The power over depicts the traditional definition we have of power, to exercise control. And there the important part is to understand it as something very fluid. And the power with speaks to building, essentially bridging and bonding social capital and thinking about movement building, thinking about connecting norm entrepreneurs to kickstart a movement, building on what Cass Sunstein also explained this morning. And lastly, the power too is the self-efficacy. Do I have the agency and the capability to change something in my household, in my community? And my assumption is, if we agree that building in the need to investigate systemic factors, designing a systems map together with people we work with to establish a common language, and critically investigating power dynamics together with behavioral design, with prototype and experimentation, we can make a much larger dent in addressing this global problem and creating a better future together. Thanks.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me. I'd like you all to just take a moment and think about a conversation you've had that either changed your attitude or behavior around something quite pertinent. Perhaps you had a casual chat with a friend about plastic waste and finally went and bought that recycling bin, or a snide comment by a stranger about how your hair smelled like smoke made you finally throw away that last pack of cigarettes. Who was that conversation with? What was it about? And what was the timing of that conversation? In the context of international development, this is what I spend most of my time thinking about. At Turn.io, we believe that an impactful conversation at a key moment in someone's life can fundamentally change their behavior. And so I'm going to tell you a bit about our work with the National Department of Health in South Africa on a program called Mom Connect. Mom Connect is a flagship program of the National Department of Health in South Africa. It was launched 5 years ago, and today we've just sent out 1 million WhatsApp and SMS messages to mothers in the country who are using the public health system about how their baby's growing and how to look after their infant until the age of 2. Mothers are also able to share a complaint or a compliment or ask any health question. And there's a dedicated team in the Department of Health, small team, that responds to those queries and follows them up. So what do these health messages look like and how were they constructed? There was a consortium of partners and stakeholders, including UN agencies, global maternal health experts, local nonprofits, technology organizations, as well as academia that were involved in coming up with a set of messages for Mom Connect. And they cover a couple of important topics around maternal and child health outcomes that are very pertinent to the National Department health protocols and policies. But they're also really behaviorally informed. And they are constructed around specific behavior change techniques, as you can see in some of these examples here today. And so this was a large-scale program that was based on an evidence-based set of messages that went to scale very quickly in the country, reaching 80% of all pregnant women accessing the public health system. But what we didn't realize when we introduced WhatsApp in 2017 was that we were going to get an absolute explosion of engagement, something we hadn't seen before on SMS. And what did that look like? So we're getting 10 times as many questions coming through WhatsApp as we were getting through SMS, and everything in between Mother's Day memes to breastfeeding videos to messages saying, "Good night, Mom Connect." The whole idea of the message set originally was to start to build a really personal relationship, an intimate relationship with a mother on which to drive further behavior change over time. And this is a real example of the types of questions we're getting. Real health questions that mothers are struggling with and they need someone personal they can reach out and talk to. So the small team at the Department of Health answers thousands of these questions every day. And what my team's trying to do at Turn.io is use behavioral insights to maximize the impact of those further conversations with mothers. So we treat those incoming questions as an opportunity for another impactful conversation over and above the standard health messages that are going out every week. And so we suggest the best evidence-based response that we know of based on the incoming question. And we use some smart technology to do that. We then draw the health worker who's answering these questions' attention to the next best behavioral milestone that we can get that mother to achieve. So, for example, if she's got an antenatal visit she should go to in the next week, we then guide the health worker to carry on the conversation about that topic. And we allow the health worker to record both intent and self-reports of any behavior change. And we're busy working on how to automate the tracking of these intents and behaviors over time. Lastly, we make sure that the overall behavioral journey for each mother is visualized alongside the conversation. So that context is really salient for the health worker who's in charge of responding. So why does all of this matter? Well, South Africa has some of the worst maternal health statistics for any country not at war. Mothers want healthy babies. The government wants healthy babies. And we really feel that an impactful conversation at a key moment can change the health behaviors that will contribute to reaching that goal. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for being here today. I'm really excited to share with you some of our preliminary findings around what works to prevent violence against children in schools. As many of you probably know, violence in schools is very pervasive. Roughly 720 million children attend schools where laws do not protect them against violence in schools. And about 1 billion children each year experience some form of violence. Levels of violence may be even higher in emergency contexts where histories of trauma and displacement may actually increase the likelihood of experiences of violence. And this violence really erodes the foundations that children need to live happy and healthy lives. It has detrimental impacts on their educational attainment, on their development, on their school performance, which can really have intergenerational impacts. And so our work then takes place in Nyarugusu refugee camp in Tanzania, which is the third largest refugee camp in the world, where roughly 150,000 Congolese and Burundian refugees live. And in this context, like so many others, violence against children in schools is pervasive. So 82% of children in this context report experiences of violence in the classroom. 58% of children report those experiences in the past week from a school staff member. This is staggering. And through interviews and focus group discussions and observations that we did in the classroom with teachers, what we learned is that teachers really felt like their behaviors were helping children to be the best versions of themselves. We're helping to prepare them for the future and helping them to respect their elders. And so we really faced an uphill battle here, coupled with very little evidence about what actually works to prevent and reduce violence in schools. In fact, only 2 interventions, school-based interventions, have been proven effective in low-resource contexts, and none of those are in humanitarian contexts. So what we did is we partnered at the International Rescue Committee, the IRC, we partnered with BIT to design modules to explore whether we could leverage insights from the behavioral sciences to help to start shifting some of these entrenched beliefs and attitudes and norms and ultimately shift teachers' behavior around the use of violence in the classroom. So, as we have heard, behaviorally informed approaches often sort of tweak the environment, and that then has an effect on behavior, which can create cognitive dissonance in a person, and their attitudes can therefore shift to better align with their behaviors. So this is sort of a traditional behavioral science approach. However, in this context, because we saw these very entrenched norms, beliefs, attitudes around the use of corporal punishment in the classroom, our sort of theory of change, our hypothesis was that if we first tackled some of those entrenched attitudes and beliefs, we could start to create an intention to change, a desire for teachers to change their behavior around the use of violence in the classroom. And we hypothesized that then a behaviorally informed intervention could be more effective. So we started with designing a messaging campaign, really, different modules to test the effectiveness of these messages on teachers' attitudes towards the use of violence in the classroom. So we have 3 different modules. The first is a rules and rights-based approach. So this is a sort of typical approach that is used by humanitarian organizations in which they say, okay, we've got all of these rules against the use of corporal punishment in the classroom. Don't do it, it's against the rules. And which we also talk about rights and the rights of children, UN Declaration, so on and so forth. We then tested this against 2 behaviorally informed modules, the first being an empathy building module. So this was really about having teachers take the perspective of children, really understanding what it must be like to be a child in a classroom who's experiencing violence. And then the third module was showing teachers the clinical evidence around the effects of the use of violence, neglect, so on, in the development, so children's actual brain development. So we showed them brain scans, for example. The 2 behaviorally informed modules, so empathy building and the clinical messaging, we also did values affirmation exercises, so having teachers reflect on their values to help them be more open to new ideas and also help to increase their self-efficacy, which was shown in previous studies. And so what we found when we asked teachers about their attitudes towards corporal punishment in the classroom was that both of the behaviorally informed modules, so empathy building and the clinical messaging, were more effective than the traditional rules and rights-based approach in shifting teachers' attitudes from being in favor to disapproving to the use of corporal punishment in the classroom. So we measured this in 2 different ways. We measured it through a values measure, and in that measure we saw a reduction of 31% in terms of teachers' approval of the use of violence against children. And in the scenario-based measure, we saw a reduction in 26%. This is pretty impressive for an hour-and-a-half module. And the idea here was that this would be not a standalone intervention, but something that we could sort of tack on to the beginning of a more comprehensive intervention to really start creating that intention to change, start to shift those attitudes so that we could then start shifting those behaviors. And so that's exactly what we did. So we partnered with BIT again to really leverage the insights from the Nimble RCT that we did, which I just described, in really helping teachers to translate this now intention to change their behavior into actual behavior change. And so EmpaTeach, the intervention which we designed, has 3 main pillars. So the first pillar is really about teacher well-being. So just imagine, these are teachers in classrooms with 250 plus children. This is a stressful environment. I mean, it can be hard to control 3 children, let alone 250. So we hypothesized that stress is one of the underlying factors that's leading to violence in schools. So well-being is a key component of this intervention. The second component of the intervention is really around equipping teachers with new skills, new classroom management techniques. We can't just say, okay, we're taking away what you've been using for years and not give them anything, right, to use in the classroom instead. And then the third pillar is really about helping teachers to plan to put all of this into action. So for example, we help teachers to identify their triggers in the classroom and then plan how they will use what they've learned and apply that instead of using violence in schools. And this is just one study that is currently being independently evaluated by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and Innovations for Poverty Action as part of a larger initiative that we currently have underway, a learning hub, which we started in Tanzania, to design new solutions to unsolved problems like this, iteratively test and adapt them, and rigorously evaluate them, and then share the learnings to increase uptake of effective interventions in the humanitarian setting in particular, in which it is sorely needed. So we're really looking forward to, when we do have the final results, sharing those with you, as well as the future studies coming out of our Learning Hub. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That was a fascinating discussion. Is my mic on? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. This was a fascinating discussion. So while we wait for the results, I know you're all very keen to see the results of our survey. Let me introduce as well the Q&A session. I have two news for you about habit formation. The first news is that some of you were very good at habit formation and in just one day are already using Slido, which is great. The second one is that we are not that good at habit formation, so we are not using Slido. So what we're going to do is we're going to take one question from Slido, and then we're going to go around. If you submitted a question, please raise your hand. We'll use the mic in the old traditional sense, and then we'll answer questions from the audience. And we don't have the answers from the survey, or do we do? Okay. Great. So this is, as you remember, when we started the session, before the Q&A, let us discuss this a minute. When we started the session, we asked you to take a survey on WhatsApp to try to understand what are the psychological levers that would take, or that would encourage you to take on more environmentally friendly behaviors. So this is the average over all the questions that you took. Which psychological levers seem to be more or less important? So it seems, and this is actually not surprising. We were wondering yesterday what this is going to be. So given the audience that we have, where we are all, aware of behavioral insights, and we're all kind of brainy people, researchers, I'm not surprised to see that for a lot of you engage with these topics at a cognitive level. So you'd like to know the stats and the facts and the figures about how this works. And then a lot of you, actually, behavioral wins, right? Like a lot of it is about making it easy, but also, then the cognitive level. Interestingly, emotional comes third, and lastly, we have the normative category. We can break it down a little bit further. We can go down and see if there is this changes by question. Could we please take it down, scroll down? So this is just a percentage, but then going down question by question, we can see that for recycling, cognitive was quite important. It seems like more, actually. And normative was the second most important, which wasn't, emotional was the second most important. So it actually went up one category. But for other ones, can we scroll down? When we talk about meat consumption, again, cognitive comes first, but behavioral was very high up there. Like the fact that it's becoming so easy to eat non-meat options is really important. It's becoming really important. And we still don't rate normative or emotional so important. Then when we think about carbon emissions, again, this is actually quite interesting. Here we have a pretty emotional attachment to this. I believe this one is the one about rising seas, but maybe I'm getting it wrong. And behavioral, again, coming second. And last question, please. Around donation, we have, again, that behavioral, just making it easy at the supermarket, maybe the most effective, but maybe there's also a cognitive reason why we would do it. Now, a caveat right there to say, it's very different when we ask a survey with a very particular audience. We know there's a difference between stated preference and revealed preferences. Maybe we would have a completely different, for example, I would hypothesize that social plays a much larger role that we let on, because we don't want to say that we are influenced by others, but maybe we are. And same for behavioral. I would assume that we would probably see something quite different if we actually tested this, which we were planning on, but became a bit too complex. So anyway, just an interesting exercise to see how actually it changes from question to question, so the diagnosis is important. I'm going to start the Q&A session actually with a very related question, which is to say, it seems like for all these issues, we are really doing a diagnosis that is very contextualized and very local. Some cases that discussion is important or trust is important. In some cases, we're talking about habit formation or power dynamics. So we are learning sometimes about short-term behaviors or long-term behaviors, but we are learning about something that is very local. How can we then generalize from these studies or take them to scale? So we're going to kick off with that question, but if you can please start thinking about your questions, we'll come to you next. Who wants to take the first question?
Well, I'll talk from our experience. So Mom Connect was scaled immediately on launch. That was the whole purpose of the program. It was built off previous evidence-based SMS services in the maternal health space. And when it launched 5 years ago, the job was to get it to 100% of people using the public health system who are pregnant. We're getting close to that. But it's an interesting dynamic when you're looking at scale. It would be very different to go to a next door country. So I think these things are very localized, but there's some general learnings in terms of understanding how, when you reach that level of scale nationally, how you start to shift the norms. So do you start to shift norms before you reach the scale? Do you use the scale to start to shift the norms? And I think that's a question we kind of ask ourselves constantly with these large-scale programs, is what comes first? Yeah.
Katherine, I think you wanted to answer as well.
Sure, yeah. So building on what Pippa was just saying, I think the idea is that there are some sort of fundamental elements of an intervention that your theory of change would support, being leveraged across various different contexts. But I think what's so important is actually that adaptation, that iterative working with communities, leveraging human-centered design so that you do actually create a tailored intervention for the given context in which you work. So for example, with EmpaTeach or intervention, it would be important for us to adapt our videos, to adapt the stories, what have you. But the core elements of, let's say, leveraging cognitive behavioral therapy to identify triggers, we would hypothesize that some of those key elements of the intervention would be more cross-cutting across contexts, but just to underscore the importance actually of that adaptation to the local context.
I believe Sonia and Ben also have a point here, so Sonia, if you...
Yeah, totally agree. I think it's the adaptation that's important. But I think what's been interesting in our work is that we've actually seen quite a lot of consistency across countries on some behaviours and not others. I think on our governance work, and actually when you sort of think about it, it makes sense when you watch media, when you discuss it and when you really recall that content and discuss it with other people, then that reinforces what you're thinking, it reinforces discussion, it generates new ideas, and I think we can all probably think about that. And so that seems to be quite consistent across countries, that if you discuss these issues, if it stimulates discussion, if what you've seen and the content of what you've seen really gets you talking, it doesn't matter if it's necessarily precisely that information or that message that you're thinking about, it's getting you to discuss that issue and topic, then that then helps to generate things like confidence and stuff. And we've definitely seen that in our governance work, where we did work across 8 countries, comparative work, and we saw some quite, we were all surprised at the consistency of the findings on that. But that's quite different to, say, like some of the health work or gender-based violence work or others, where there's a lot more sort of deep entrenched misconceptions and values that tend to be very contextually specific. But, I mean, of course, you have like different political contexts, but even in that, the sort of power of what media can do seem to be quite consistent. And you still needed to tweak it a bit to make it more local, perhaps if there was more engagement at the local level rather than national, but there were consistencies.
It's probably adaptation also to gain credibility, right? And that trust that is like, oh, that's someone that's similar to me that applies to me.
Yeah.
Ben, you had a point as well. You wanted to answer the question around scale?
Yeah, following up what has been said, I would double down on intellectual humility. The problem is that humble people usually say that they're humble. But I think a start could also be to, at least in your teams, not think of a theory of change, but as assumptions of effects. I argue that outcomes are actually, and changes, the emergent property of complex systems. And I do think if we think about principles of interventions that we can generalize, we have to package them into assumptions if we want to scale them or adapt them in different contexts. Briefly on SASA, successful in Uganda. And it consists of finding non-entrepreneurs, activists, and working with them individually, having them train couples in individual couples therapy, and having the activists work with community leaders and on the community level. That model transferred to Rwanda had good effects, but the people who adapted it were smart enough to break it in parts and saw that only the couples therapy contributed to the positive effects, and the activism on the community level had zero effect. Why? Because the political context and the notion of activism is radically different in Rwanda than it's in Uganda, the notion of civil society. So, like, not thinking we know the ingredients, let's just scale it, but breaking it down again in like humble assumptions and test out what works, I think is one of the important design principles.
Fascinating. That's a great point. We have a question over here. Yes, go ahead.
Thanks very much. Great presentations. I particularly wanted to ask a question, highlight what Sonia Whitehead had been talking about. First of all, privileged to pay BBC licence fee, hearing about the kinds of work that you're doing. And that is changing behaviour at scale. It's not targeted, and you were showing some very large effects, particularly for immediate and experienced effects, such as in Bangladesh with the effects of the environment and climate change. I wanted to say that while you've got large effects, it's incredibly difficult for any of us to study mechanisms. So you talked quite confidently, and I haven't read the papers, I'll go and look at them, about social norms mediating your effects. Technically, that requires a measurement of social norms before and after. How confident are you that the social norms mediated the effects, and you didn't get an effect of the behaviour changing the social norms, which comes back to the topic of this session?
It is very complex. I mean, there was quite a lot of research that was done as part of that, which I didn't really have time. I mean, the social norms were broken down into a lot of different questions, and a sort of index was created, and that was built from qualitative research that was done to do that. But I probably perhaps sounded a bit more confident because of trying to make it simple for the case of this presentation. But I think what we've seen was just how much sort of particular sort of social norms are in play. But if you really identified those initially, and the programme was really looking at those, we did see that from a qualitative sense when we were doing panels with mothers and husbands and mother-in-laws, and actually we did some triangulation as well. So we asked mother-in-laws, husbands and mothers from the same household and did triads and analysis from that. That we could... But, I mean, of course, you can never say. And we actually also did an RCT as well that looked at some of this too. So we can share those results. But, of course, yeah, I mean, I think we did see that if the drama really addressed some quite specific misconceptions and specific norms. And when you looked at it at the specific level, you could do it. So it sounds a bit broader when you say that it was a broad index that was used across different attributes. But actually, when you looked at the particular attributes and then how the drama itself had addressed those attributes, we felt a little bit more confident.
And there's probably a positive feedback there as well between behaviour and social norms. Another question from the audience? Do we have anyone? And this is why... Oh, we do have one. Yeah, you can just say it. Or you have the mic right there on the back.
Hi, thanks for your very nice sharing. So my question is on the idea of identifying the systemic elements that might impact the situation that we're looking at. So I think maybe it's more for Ben, but also I welcome the other panel members to comment. So I wonder, where do we start? And sometimes I'm speaking as someone who's working in government, so I wonder, like, sometimes from our position, we might have limited control. So where could we start? Like, do you have any advice on that?
Would anyone of you like to?
Is my question clear? Sorry.
By bringing my 2 cents on this is, obviously we have to draw boundaries when dealing with complexity. And as a practical start, my experience is bring the people in the room who are part of the change process to make sense of the system. Obviously, that needs to be preceded by thinking what are the crucial elements we need to have in our perspective. On gender-based violence, that's the economic livelihood situation, that's education, potentially infrastructure, and then make together sense of that system. And there are sufficient methodologies out there. I really urge you to not hire a consultant to produce a systems map for a godlike overview. That is not useful in my experience, but the process to establish a common language and ideally identify areas in the system that are ripe for intervention, I think can really augment the work of particularly behavioral science, where I see right now when behavioral experiments address complex problems, they seem sometimes a bit random and more tactical than a piece of the puzzle for larger systemic changes. And that's why I think the two worlds could be in a really great marriage of coming closer together.
Fantastic. So we're almost at time, even though I see a question, I'm sorry. But I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to find out if you had any final thoughts you wanted to share. If none, then we're at time. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.